you. Thank you. I'm taking a big risk, and I'm actually going to just refer to my paper on this. I've never done this before, so we'll see how it goes. I might be wishing I had my, pages to flip through, but thank you for your patience, and again, thank you for being here. So let's start with Deleuze and Guattari. Actually, this is just Deleuze. So when we look at the title of the book, Thinking with Theory, what I'll do in the presentation today is really break down what all of that is, what it all does. So the first thing I'll try to talk through is, what does it mean to think? What is the practice of thinking? Then I'll say a little bit about, well, what do we mean by theory in our text? Because there's a lot of different disciplines represented in here. There are a lot of different levels of theory that people work with. And I'll talk through that a little bit as well. And then try to put all that together in terms of, well, what do those practices look like when you're thinking with theory in an analytic way? And we call it a new analytic for a particular reason that I'll get into a bit later. All right, so here we go. So this is Deleuze in his book Nietzschean Philosophy. Thought does not need a method. So this is what you were mentioning earlier. Method in general is a means by which we avoid going to a particular place, or by which we maintain the option of escaping from it. So I'm choosing to begin with this because I want you to kind of hold on to this idea throughout the next 30, 45 minutes, is that thought does not need a method, that the ways in which we begin to practice thinking is not really methodological. There isn't a plan or a path for it. So it's really something that is emergent in the middle of everything that you do. It's not something you can plan to do. So that'll be a major theme through the talk. So as I keep going through this morning, I'm going to situate this work that we call Thinking with Theory, not as a method that has a script, but as a new analytic. Every truth, Deleuze wrote, is of a time and of a place. Thus, in our book, we work within and against the truths of humanist, conventional, and interpretive forms of inquiry and analysis that have created and dominated qualitative research texts and practices. And what that means is there's just a real proliferation of books and articles and courses that are about how to do qualitative research. And there's a lot of humanist and conventional assumptions in that I'll return to later. So as we wrote this book, we really proceeded with a sense of hesitation and instability, because there is no formula for doing this work. It's something that is to come, something that happens in the moment, and something that is emergent. It's unpredictable, it's always rethinkable, and always redoable. And I think that's what we try to emphasize in each chapter of the book, is that there are different ways of doing this each time. So discussing his own power knowledge analysis, Foucault explained, quote, "What I've written is neither prescriptive either for me or for others. At most, it's instrumental and tentative." And we take that very seriously in this methodology. So following Foucault, I want to caution that thinking with theory does not follow a particular method. Rather, it relies on a willingness to borrow and reconfigure concepts from philosophy. It relies on the invention of new approaches that are embedded and emergent in the current work. And it creates new assemblages that demonstrate a range of analytic practices of thought, creativity, and most importantly, intervention. And that word will get more important as we proceed here. So we've tried to distance ourselves from conventional meanings and uses of many words from our vocabulary that we are burdened with, much of the language that comes from our humanist history. And one of those big words is analysis, okay, qualitative data analysis. The point is, we can't think analysis differently without also disrupting notions of data, voice, experience, representation, and so on. So as prompted by our readings of Deleuze, these signifiers cannot hold the same places as they did in humanist inquiry. Each of these concepts and practices, though they have been deconstructed, assumes its own structure and carries its own ontological and epistemological weight, given the philosophical framework from which it flows. And I've got some examples of that a bit later. We take the position that humanist concepts in qualitative inquiry, such as data, analysis, voice, and so on, can be put to strange new uses, as encouraged by Deleuze and Guattari, when animated in different philosophical frameworks. So one example of this is power. It shifts from a possession, power is a possession in feminist frameworks or critical frameworks, to a relation when moving from structural to post-structural work. It follows then that the signifier data analysis, as it is conceived and practiced in post-positivism and constructionism, needs to be thought differently in order to make what St. Pierre coins the post-qualitative turn. Thus, our use of concepts as practices are used cautiously and hesitantly with a specific force in particular frameworks. So in this book, we use theory and concepts as practices, not as simply these things that we're trying to describe, but we're using it, we're putting them to work to open up new ways of approaching problems in educational research. So chapters in qualitative textbooks, and if you've taken qualitative research, and I've used these chapters too, because you have to know what you're working against in order to do something different. So you kind of have to know what the conventional and traditional ways of doing things that we've inherited from anthropology and ethnography from other disciplines. So our work in social science education, qualitative research, comes from somewhere. We didn't get to make it up. We inherited it from elsewhere. But we can create something new, and that's what's exciting. We can do something different. So chapters in qualitative textbooks, even entire books, are devoted to teaching data analysis as mechanistic coding, reducing data to themes, and writing up transparent and transferable, there's that word, narratives. And we think that such approaches preclude dense and multi-layered treatment of data. Thus, we are not alone in our assertion that conventional data analysis, which involves technical coding and thematic extraction, has its foundations in positivism, with its emphasis on sorting, simplification, and generalizations. And it's actually data organization rather than what we would consider analysis. Therefore, we respond to Patty Lather's urge to grasp what is on the horizon in terms of new analytics and practices of inquiry, to make way for the invention of something new that can't be fully described or prescribed. And thus we play at the edges of what might be going on when thinking with theory happens, when the possibility of thought is right there on the horizon and emergent. So like Whitehead's process philosophy, the reality is the process. And entities being, and in this case, what we're now calling a process methodology. So we've coined this phrase now as we've worked through the work over the last few years, is saying, well, this is really about the process. It's about the doing of the methodology. So a process methodology is constituted by its becoming. This is the principle of process. In other words, a process methodology, thinking with theory, is both its generative movement as well as its own effect. Bell wrote that, quote, as Whitehead makes clear, the facts so dear to the positivists, and we would add conventional qualitative researchers, are simply abstractions that come at the end of processes. So data analysis comes in a stage. It's something that happens after you do these other things. You have to do this other work, and then you analyze, and then you write it up. Well, we're trying to say that no, that all that happens at once. So how do we do that all at once? I'll explain later on that thinking with theory does not come at the end of anything, but is emergent and immanent to that which is becoming. The actual world, according to Whitehead, is a process. It is, as a process philosophy, and in our case a process methodology, about a worlding. So I want to say something about that word worlding for a moment. That's Brian Masumi's word. So in traditional, conventional qualitative research, which I learned in the 80s and early 90s, it's about perspectives of people's worlds, right? That's your goal when you're collecting qualitative data, is you want to understand people's experiences and their stories. However, what we're trying to show in our book is that when we start doing this work of analysis, whatever that is, it's actually creating worlds. Right? Rather than just mirroring perspectives of worlds, we're actually creating new worlds. And that's what happens in any act of interpretation or analysis, even if you're doing straight up conventional interpretive work. You're still worlding. We're just trying to bring that to the front of what we're doing. So this idea of worlding is about creativity that overcomes habitual repetitions and sedimented or inherited ways of being. So in the remainder of what I'll talk about this morning, I'll follow the contours of what happens when the work of thinking with theory is done as a process methodology, one which gives up static properties of linear method and even cyclical iterative stages and procedures of conventional qualitative data collection and analysis. Instead, I want to favor dynamic becomings and generative differentiations. That is, a thinking with theory process methodology is entirely ontological. So we see this methodology as moving away from epistemology and people's perspectives grounded in identity, which is important, but we also want to start paying attention to the ontological side. What new worlds and possibilities get created by reimagining people's perspectives in different frameworks? Because those frameworks don't come from nowhere. They're also created. So Barad calls an ontology not a thing, but a doing. So if I just look at the book, I really think about this book not as a thing, but a doing. And that's a very Deleuzian concept. A book is not a thing, it does something. So you read the book, you're confused, you're frustrated, you don't know what it means, but it's doing something to you, right? Theory does that as well, concepts do that as well, data can do that as well to you. Data is not this thing that's separate from you, that you go and collect, but you are always embedded in that data because you have asked the questions, you have done the observations, so you have created a world simply by being there. So that's Barad, not a thing but a doing. So we recognize that in naming yet another practice in qualitative inquiry, we are creating realities and we are making worldings. However, we see the invention of new concepts, such as thinking with theory, as part of the new empirical practices in qualitative research. So if you've paid attention to the last 2 years, there's been a lot of special issues in qualitative inquiry, cultural studies, critical methodologies, qualitative studies in education that have centered on the new empiricisms that have been happening in the humanities for the last decade, the new materialisms that have happened in feminist studies and gender studies, all that's been happening in the humanities for the last 10 years. So in the social sciences, we're trying to, in anthropology even, they had their AAA conference a few years ago was all on ontology and the new empiricisms. And so we're trying to bring that work into our field. That's what we're trying to do, is thinking very transversally about our disciplines and not just staying, in education, trying to liven it up a little bit and reflect what's going on in the larger field. Unlike other methods, we hope our process methodology stays on the move, that is not reduced to simply another way of doing something after data collection, assuming that theory is not some form of data, or that data are not produced by theory. So I want to read that sentence again. It's really, really important. We're assuming that theory is also a form of data, and we're also assuming that data are produced by theory. When people tell you a story, they have a theoretical perspective that is behind that story. So you're getting an interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation. Clifford Geertz has that wonderful line in one of his essays that it's turtles all the way down, like you open up one. And I was walking around campus yesterday, I went to the turtle pond, and they were all kind of piled up on each other, and I was like, oh, I took a picture of it, and I was thinking, Clifford Geertz. But that's that image of you pick up one turtle, there's another turtle, you pick up another, and it's turtles all the way down. And what he's simply trying to illustrate is that every story is layered with interpretation and worldviews that are really grounded in a theory. And you can, once you start listening, you can hear theory come out of people's stories. They have ways of even if it's just an everyday experience. So it's never this pure story that you're getting that's unfiltered from this original source. I mean, you try to tell a story about something that happened 4 years ago, and it's got all these layers of meaning piled on top of it. So what do we do as researchers to sift through that? Well, that's where theory helps us to make sense of that. If you've listened to the podcast Serial, that's one of the first things they deal with in the first 3 episodes or so, is that when Sarah Koenig's trying to reconstruct the stories from these people, she starts to realize how complicated it is to put together a story based on one event. Have y'all listened to that podcast? Okay, so maybe go back and listen to it again with theory in mind, and you'll see how this works. Okay, so what I'll talk about next, I'll stop ad-libbing so much, I need to stick to my script. So what I'll talk about next is the necessity of theory in this work, and I'll say a little bit about what we say theory is, okay, so I'll just go on since I've used some space. Okay, so the next part is the necessity of theory. So this is Brian Massumi again, and if you're reading Deleuze for the first time and struggling, I really recommend Massumi's A User's Guide to Capitalism and Schizophrenia. It's a nice companion book. Whenever I tell students who are reading things that are too hard for them to read, and I read things all the time that are way too hard for me to read, and I have to read and reread and reread, I really think it's important to co-read. So go find somebody who's written, like Brian Massumi is a wonderful translator and interpreter of Deleuze. And I remember being in grad school, and I had this Massumi's book in one hand and 1,000 Plateaus in the other hand. And I would read Massumi, and as soon as he mentioned something, I would go find it in 1,000 Plateaus and then read that. So co-reading and rereading is really important in graduate school. And as professors, we still have to do that work too. All right, so this is Massumi. The meaning of an event can be rigorously analyzed, but never exhaustively, because it is the effect of an infinitely long process of selection determining that these two things, of all things, meet in this way, at this place in time, in this world, out of all possible worlds. So that's really important to think about when you're doing any kind of analytic or interpretive work. You're making selections and cuts to say something at this time, in this way, at this moment. And that's just one world out of many possible worlds. So that's really daunting to think about, this work that we do. In a paper presented at the American Educational Research Association in April 2004, which feels like a million years ago, Patty Lather stated, the term that matters in this moment of the post is away from abstracting philosophizing and toward concrete efforts to put the theory to work. Thinking with theory is our attempt to put theory to work with philosophical ideas and various theories toward a rigorous, but not exhaustive, approach to developing a new analytic practice for qualitative inquiry. We use theory not to exhaust possible explanations, but to open up previously unthought approaches to thinking. We would like to clarify, or I would like to clarify, how we are approaching this concept of theory, because that word takes on many different meanings in the academy. For our purposes, we are not referring to the development of theoretical models of specific phenomenon, which is the way the term theory is often used in ed psych, in policy, or in my department in particular, leadership studies. Neither are we referring to traditional grounded theory that foregoes contradictions and inconsistencies, or that differentiates between theory, or more specifically, according to Adele Clark, who does deconstruction, quote, data that are constructed versus data that are pure. Instead, we are using this term, as it is often used in contemporary humanities-based disciplines, to refer more to philosophical questions about what counts as knowledge, what counts as real in educational settings, and who has the authority to determine this. So those are the types of things that get opened up when we think with theory. It's not just meaning making, but it's the conditions under which meaning is grappled with. And you are part of that condition. So why in my work in particular do I think that theory is a necessity? So for researchers engaged in methodological discussions, questions of what counts as knowledge and reality, and how researchers produce and are produced by research practices are very important. As we approach research in contexts described by Deleuze as, quote, situations in which we no longer how to react to, in spaces which we no longer how to describe, end quote, we embrace the practice of putting theory to work in a move that begins to create a language and a way of thinking methodologically and philosophically together that is up to this task. In my view, it is my view that reading and using theory is necessary to shake us out of the complacency of seeing, hearing, thinking, feeling as we always have or might have. In other words, I have become more and more aware of how my own experiences, as you know, all these identity categories, I could rattle them off, actually limit how I can understand something. You know, sometimes my own experiences get in the way and shape what I'm trying to understand. So I need something to help me think differently. Without taking seriously the epistemological orientations that both ground and limit us, research can become little more than a focus on method, rather than a troubling of both what counts as knowledge and reality, and how such knowledge and reality are produced. So in this work, those are the questions. It's not making meaning or trying to understand. We're out of that paradigm altogether. Instead, we're deconstructing what counts and how it's produced. What are the conditions under which this truth was told? And what claim to truth is this data making? So Maggie McClure wrote about her interest in the capacity of theory to offend. And I love this article, if you can find it, if your library gets the Journal of Education Policy. Wonderful article called The Offense of Theory. I suggest that theory's capacity to offend is also its power to unsettle, to open up static fields of habit and practice. Like McClure, we agree that the value of theory in our work, quote, lies in its power to get in the way, to offend and interrupt, to block the reproduction of the obvious, and to open up new possibilities for thinking and doing. So how can theory move you beyond an imperative to know toward the interrogation of unproblematized practices in educational research? As Deleuze in Dialogue with Foucault put it, quote, a theory does not totalize. It's an instrument for multiplication, and it also multiplies itself. As soon as a theory is enmeshed in a particular point, we realize that it will never possess the slightest practical importance unless it can erupt in a totally different area, end quote. In our book, Thinking with Theory, we wrote about borrowing theoretical concepts such as power, desire, marginality, interaction from philosophers in disciplines other than our own. We did this on purpose to enable an eruption of new questions and previously unthought knowledge, rather than a reproduction of what was known based on our own experience as women in the academy and that of our participants. These eruptions were analytic questions that emerged in the middle of things and moved us beyond an easy sense, something that I'll come back to in a moment. Such a practice resulted in using theory to produce questions about, for example, how Foucauldian power was functioning in our research with first-generation academic women, or ways in which these women resisted attempts to be defined and located by others. Thus, we use theory not only to trouble received practices and ways of knowing, but also what Deleuze refers to as an instrument for multiplication. So if you don't know anything about the book, what we did to multiply, we took the exact same data excerpts from interviews, reproduced them in 6 different chapters using 6 different theorists to really rigorously open up meaning and what was happening. We didn't exhaust meaning, but we really tried to rigorously multiply it. So what I want to emphasize this slide before about McClure's advice about not enhancing the street cred of theory by sticking some examples to it or finding or using theory to basically apply it to data. Our analytic practice instead enacts specific concepts as we work theory and data together to illustrate how everything shifts and multiplies on this uneven terrain. To think with Deleuze, for example, or Foucault, or whoever it is you're thinking with, is not to use select concepts and to illustrate these figurations with examples of data. That's not what we're doing. Rather, as Manning and Masumi explain, to think with Deleuzian concepts engages with, quote, new processes more than new products, to energize new modes of activity that seem to offer a potential to escape or overspill ready-made challenges into the dominant value system, end quote. So we put theory to work to see how it functions within problems and opens them up to the new. Theory is responsive, not an application or a reflection. So that's a really important point. If you're trying to do this work and trying to explain it to your committee or your colleagues, say this: theory is responsive. It's not an application or a reflection. And then your committee will say, okay, go for it. All right, so here's an example. We consider not how a particular theorist defines assemblage, be it Deleuze and Guattari, or Masumi, or Jane Bennett, or Ian Buchanan, or even Alfred Whitehead. And they all work with assemblage, and so we're not really interested in the definition of it. This is what we're interested in. And we also do not look for examples in our field notes or transcripts that are examples of what counts as an assemblage. And to extend this point, for example, Lisa and I have both worked on voice in qualitative inquiry. And we've considered how we treat voice both as an assemblage and its function in an assemblage, to see how it works, not as something to be mined in the textual artifacts of our research, nor something to which we ascribe meaning by a focus on what our participants say. By putting a concept to work, we begin to think voice as that which is entangled in the interaction of things and doings in an assemblage. So voice does this other thing. It animates bodies, it animates words, it animates histories, materialities, affects, and so on. Voice is doing a lot. It's not just telling a story. Theory, according to McClure, quote, stops us from forgetting that the world is not laid out in plain view before our eyes or coyly disposed to yield its secrets to our penetrating analyses, end quote. Foucault reminds us that theory does not express, theory does not translate, nor is it an application. Theory is practice. It is this practice of theory that I'll go to next. And I'll try to describe a little bit about what we're doing when we do this work. Here's Foucault again. He makes many appearances here. As people begin to no longer be able to think things the way they have been thinking them, transformation becomes at the same time very urgent, very difficult, and entirely possible. So you may have had this experience where you start reading a theorist and you're like, that is my language. These words, this theory, this concept is already in my bones, and it's speaking to me, it's saying something to me. It's giving me a way to see and experience and articulate a world that has not been previously articulated. You know, if you've read Discipline and Punish by Foucault, and the section where he describes prisons and schools as identical practices happening in prisons and schools to produce a docile subject, I mean, that still has relevance even now in 2017. That language helps you to see those interconnections between different disciplines and institutional practices, and helps you to be able to articulate something different in a new way. And the point of doing all this is to transform it, to change it. So I want to talk a little bit about the threshold, because I think it's an important figuration that we use in the first chapter of the book, and I think it's an important way of thinking about this as a practice. So we use the figuration of the threshold to situate both our relationship with and the work of theory in qualitative research. And it's a position, we position the practice of thinking in our research encounters as being in this moment of a threshold. So in a threshold, things enter and meet, you know, like the threshold of a doorway. They flow or pass into one another, or break open or exit into something else. So I just talked about theory as being necessary in your work, because it keeps knowing and being in the middle of things, in the threshold, in a state of in-betweenness, and that is a state of becoming. The threshold incites change, movement, and transformation of thought in qualitative inquiry. For a moment in a threshold where thinking happens, everything and everyone, including you, becomes someone else and something else. The in-betweenness of the threshold offers up temporary but a forceful site for problematizing and thinking the new. Deleuze and Guattari wrote, quote, "Philosophy is the art of forming, inventing, and fabricating concepts," end quote. That is, we avoid traps of reinscribing analytic practices that can lead to generalities, themes, and patterns that are bound to representational dogmatic logic. And instead, we pursue practices that open up thought. Now, I want to say something about the threshold, because the threshold is kind of an energizing, mixed up place of becoming, and you don't want to be there very long. It's very exhausting to be in a threshold for a very long time. It's a place that you want to sweep through and stay in just long enough to be able to hold that space of difference and really play with opening up thought. So I'm reading this really wonderful book. It's came out in 2014 called Thought in the Act. It's by Aaron Manning and Brian Masumi. So in that book, they attempt to give words to the encounter that they describe as practices of modes of thought. And they believe that thinking is practice. And I've been really picking up on their language. That's a language that really speaks to me, is they don't position thinking as something that just happens in the brain. You know, thinking happens with the entire body. It's not necessarily a human activity. There are things that happen in the world that are also thought processes that we can start paying attention to. But they essentially see it as not something that that is just something that we're just innately endowed to do, but it's actually something that is a practice and that we have to work on. We have to read and prepare ourselves to be able to really, really think. Their project, much like what we do in the book, is to activate, create, and set things in motion. Masumi and Manning write of techniques not as descriptive devices, but as springboards, activating practices from within and setting things in motion. So thinking in the threshold keeps things on the move. It keeps things becoming. It's not only epistemological in terms of knowledge production, but it's also ontological, to refer back to what I said earlier about creating something new and new worldings. The threshold of thinking reminds us that there's radical possibility in the unfinalized because of the constitutive and generative aspects of all texts. So thinking then happens in the middle of things. It moves things. And Masumi wrote, "Thought strikes like lightning with sheer ontogenetic force. It is felt, and thinking is of potential." So all this work around thinking by Masumi and Manning is grounded in Deleuze's work in Difference and Repetition, another big philosophical book, where he says that the practice of thinking has been traditionally, conventionally, heralded as reflection. You know, that thinking is just reflection, representation, and what he's trying to say, what Deleuze is trying to introduce, is that thinking actually happens by force, that something happens in the field, like you're doing field work, and it's a shock to you, and you don't know how to think about it. And that is the moment when thinking happens, is when you don't even understand what's going on, and you don't even have your own toolkit to try to figure it out. And that is when thought really begins to happen. That's Deleuze's standpoint, and I happen to go with that too. So in a threshold, when thinking is flowing through, what happens is that it's seeking connectives to interrupt thought. Thinking is a productive force in that it is seeking difference. The middle is not an average. So if you're in the middle of the threshold, I'm not talking about this average here. So this is a very different orientation of language. So when you're reading Deleuze and Foucault and they say things like the middle, they don't mean the average. They're saying that the middle is excess. So they invoke things like weeds and rhizomes, and that when you're in the middle of a weed, that's where you see all this excess, and that it just travels through and starts to grow. And that's how things grow. It is through the middle that things grow. So we engage thinking as a site of transformation and recognize that for anything to become, be it data, theory, the subject, or knowledge, there needs to be movement, another break, another connection, more contamination. And I think that's what we try to do in our book with theory, is we try to contaminate the data with something different to say something different. And excess procreates. Work in the threshold cannot be described using representational logic, and that simply means this is like that. Thinking is not a reflection, it's not reception, nor is it contained in the mind. Thinking is not outside of a project, but sprouts as a line from within, and it takes on prehensive qualities, what Robinson describes as, quote, a non-cognitive feeling guiding how the occasion shapes itself from the data of the past and the potentialities of the future. Prehension is an intermediary, a purely immanent potential power. So thinking is always of potential. You're always trying to see what newness can I open up when I'm actually thinking, and not just recognizing or resembling or representing. So thinking is a rhythmic open onto and into newness. So thinking as a process methodology emerges into and continues through potentials of creativity. And I'm going to skip down some. So I've got a section on assumptions going into humanism, but I think I'll skip that. So we can get to, okay, why did you do that? Go back. I'm gonna skip all the humanism stuff. Y'all probably know what humanism is. So everybody can be jotting a question down. Okay, so let me just pick up here, and I'll try to wrap up in 5 minutes. So we use theories, concepts, and research encounters and materials that we have at our disposal to open up that which we cannot think without. So in my work anymore, I can't not think without Foucault or Elizabeth Grosz or Erin Manning lately. She's my new academic crush. And so when I read their work, I'm constantly thinking about how they are opening up my ways of thinking, how they are forcing me to consider something different. And if we want to say that there's a method to this work, that's the method. The method is reading. So that's kind of where I'm going now, I think. Okay. All right, so in our work thinking with theory, it is difficult and even unnecessary, I would say, to draw clear distinctions between how data collection, and analysis function or work. Approaching analysis as something that happens after all the records of research have been collected burdens the researcher with making such distinctions. Distinctions between what counts and what doesn't count as data. Distinctions between when is an interview, who speaks in an interview, or what is happening in an interview. Distinctions about when and where data analysis occurs. Distinctions between what or who acts with a gentle force. If we return to a concept of agency within the post frameworks, there is no essentialist human subject that is the sole purveyor of agency. There is no separate individual person, no participant in an interview study to which a single voice can be linked. All are entangled, and that's a Baradian word. She does this work on ontology that shows that all objects in a particular environment are entangled and affect each other, and she does works on physics, so she's applying that also to ways in which we produce knowledge. People often ask me and Lisa when we're giving campus talks or in workshops, will any theory do? Can I just use any theory or any concept? And they also ask, well, how do you choose your theory? And I always say, well, the theory chooses you. You don't just go pluck something down. You're reading, and it's like it's your jam, and you're like, this is what I need to think with and do something, say something different with. So we think that there needs to be a different set of questions. What is the doing of the concept or theory? What is the doing of the concept or theory? What are you doing with it? And where is that doing happening? So if you're writing a dissertation and you write your chapter, whatever it is, I don't even know anymore because my students don't do the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the theory chapter, if that's only where the theory is, then you're not really thinking with theory. You're just sticking it in there and performing an academic imperative to write up a theory paper, but you're not thinking with it if it's just there. So if it's relegated to a certain place in a project, Or is it entangled in the production of thought and practice? Is theory thresholding, in other words? What distinctions are being made in your research, and how do those distinctions hinder the unthought? For example, in interpretive and perhaps even some critical methodologies, and I do critical work as well, it is important to give, importance is given to, y'all have heard these phrases, rich, thick description, making voices heard, women's experiences. Now, we do not doubt that projects that aim to theorize gender use particular theories and concepts to center their frameworks. Yet, a lot of these traditional traditions and categories are grounded in humanism and making those distinctions. And so I can talk about that a little bit more. But the point of what we're trying to say here is that there are no distinctions in this work, that data gets opened up to include everything, theory gets opened up to include all of the voices that are in the text. So we don't make distinctions between that. Why does the literature review have to be in that chapter? Why can't the literature be used to animate knowledge in a different way, and not in a replication kind of way, but to show that this has already been done, so what can we say that's different? Okay, I'll wrap up. So to think with theory is to enter a text wherever you are, and that's Spivak. And so we have done this work of plugging in. Let me skip all that. So when people say, well, how do you choose your theory? I've already said that it really is, what are you reading in the moment that is your language? And we also believe that co-reading is really important. So when we're reading theory alongside other texts, when we're reading interview transcripts, for example, field notes, news or social media, and other materials with theory, we are making what Spivak calls rearranging our mental furniture. So I want to maybe start to end with Spivak here. This is from her book On Reading. It is a very difficult thing reading theory well. When we are reading in this way, we are internalizing. Theorizing is a practice. Our own way of thinking changes, so that when we are reading, all of the theoretical reading begins to organize our reading, not because we are applying it. Reading theory is like athletics. First-class athletes do not think about the moves they make. They do not apply what they have been taught. It comes in as a reflex. And if you look at the instant replay, you watch muscle memory perform. This is how one uses other people's theory, with respect, preparing oneself to be able to read it and following through. In order to prepare yourself that way, you enter the protocol of the other person's theory, enter its private grammar, so that the theory transforms you. So Lisa and I have both co-read texts produced from, with, and about cheerleaders. I work on cheerleaders sometimes, working class girls, first-generation academic women, and white teachers, alongside Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, Barad, Manning, following the conceptual grammar and allowing transformations to emerge. In this way, we can never inductively analyze or code, as conventional qualitative research or grounded theory methodologists would have us do. We need a thinking with theory process methodology to give us the concepts, languages, and practices that enable a knotting of texts together, a doing that proceeds from the middle of all of the work, a new analytic practice that enters and exits sideways in an imminent unfolding where distinctions fall apart. It is made possible only by plugging in not merely concepts, but the entire ontological and epistemological orientation. As Spivak asserts, deep engagement with the theoretical terrain is necessary. For example, to produce a new analytic about Foucauldian power, insight into his theory of the subject, knowledge, and agency is essential. So I've got like 10 more pages. I can't believe that. But so I'll stop. And we can take some time to talk about it. The last part is an example, a different example from what's in the book, but just shows the example. But I think I'm going to pull this slide up just so we have it up as we ask questions. So in the book we give four, I'll end with this. In the book we have four, not methods per se, but practices, what we think we're doing when we do thinking with theory methodology. We put philosophical concepts to work by disrupting the theory data binary, by decentering each, and instead show how they make one another. So in the book, what we try to do over and over again is show how theory is made differently. So theory doesn't emerge as this stable, static thing. We're trying to say something different theoretically as well as about whatever data we're playing with. Number 2, being deliberate and transparent in what analytical questions are made possible. And these always emerge in the middle of reading. Right, so we don't start a project, you usually start a project with a research question. Well, we don't do that. We just start reading and we start playing with whatever we're interested in, and we see what questions emerge, what comes up in the middle of the co-reading the data and the theory together. 2 more and then I'll stop. We work the text repeatedly to deform them, make them groan and protest with an overabundance of meaning, which not only in turn creates new knowledge, but also shows the suppleness of both theory and knowledge, and ontology even. And then finally, this isn't really a method, but it's kind of a something we think that happens when we're doing this work. Disrupting when and how this work occurs, refusing it as a stage in a procedure, and using it as the process itself. So we consider these 4 undoings of qualitative methodology in this work. So I have a real snazzy ending, but I will not go there because we need a few minutes for questions or comments. But thanks for listening, and I hope it was helpful to clarify some of what we're doing in this work. So thanks.
So we have some time for questions, and I have to pass this around so that the camera can.
So my question is, I really appreciated the talk. I really appreciated thinking with you as you were talking. And I think while you were talking, I was also thinking through a lot of data that we have right now in a project that we're working on, and just thinking through that while listening. So that was really nice. I was wondering.
So you were doing analysis.
I would.
Yes.
Thinking for sure, definitely, yeah. So my question is about kind of the privileging of the new. I always get this sense when I'm deep in a lot of the theorists that you used in the book, that there is this privileging of the new thought or the new way of thinking about something. But meanwhile, I'm really I'm thinking a lot because of the communities I work with. Black liberationist thought, for example, or critical race theory, and how when I read it, I get this sense that this is very old. This is not, people have been saying this for a very long time, but a lot of communities choose not to listen or get on board, or whatever that means. But I'm thinking about like this kind of privileging of a new way of thinking, and I don't know if that new way is embedded in it's new to the person that's doing, or the people who are reading it, or if it's new to the world, or when you think about this kind of like, it's different, it's new, where you're thinking that newness lies, because I feel like there's a lot of going this way, but there's a lot of people saying really important things that have been saying for a long time that we don't use in our necessarily, maybe often enough in our educational work. So I just thought.
Yeah. Do you want me to say something about that?
Yeah, no, that was not a complete thought.
No, it is. Yeah, I think every project is so individual that this kind of framework is not something that just can be universally applied. Sure. I think seeking the new is a speculative process. If we follow kind of what the way in which philosophy is moving right now, what everyone seems to be writing about is going back to Whitehead in the 20s and 30s, and what he was writing about is speculative work, and that seems to be really exciting. But I don't think that you have to ignore the old to create the new. I think that automatically that sets up a binary opposition of the old is no good anymore. So I don't know that's really the case, but the new is really more this turn to to create something different. So it really is a focus on ontology. All this phrasing around the new empiricisms and the new ontologies is really about moving away from simple representation and reflection and into creating something, a more just and sustainable world. I mean, it's really political in that way, and it is a privileging of, we think about it, it's a privileging of the academy and philosophy and all of that. But, the example that we give is that when we interviewed these women in the academy who were all first-generation academics, and we didn't even have to do anything to see the themes and the patterns. Like, we didn't have to code. I mean, they were just there. Imposter syndrome, just sexism. I mean, it was all over the data, right? I mean, it was everywhere. And we could have written up one of these ed leadership articles that would have been straight up, this research has been, we know this, 30 years, 40 years, we know this. This is just, why do we need to keep repeating the things that we already know? So what the new helped us to do was to think about it in some more complex political ways that gave us a language to be able to say something different. I mean, we were still talking about sexism, we were still talking about race and women's bodies, but we were using theories like interaction to be able to understand how materiality produces something, and that's something that we're not really haven't been talking about in the last 10 years in ed research is the materiality of things and their force. So I think that the new just simply helps to make things much more complex rather than just an easy sense, and recognizable. Because we know all these things about women in the academy. We know it's happening. I mean, maybe administration doesn't really listen very well. I'm talking about like upper, not you. But we know those problems are there. And so what are some different ways that we can now begin speaking about them and talking about them that may cause people to listen differently? And so, there is a privileging of the new simply in terms of creation. And I think that is the move that the humanities and the ontological empirical turn have forced us to look at, is that how much longer can we keep reproducing what is known and replicating what is known? How can we start creating something that's really different? And that's what the work is, in my view, is this creation.
Yeah, thank you. That's really cool.
So think creation, invention, but also intervention. Can we intervene in stuck ways of knowing that we all know and that aren't really doing anything, but except just, there is a paradigm of replication in ed research, like just more of this same knowledge will help to build this, edifice of, well, we know it's a problem. Well, does it have to be repeated over and over to be a problem? I think that sometimes the most dangerous things are those encounters that shock us, that aren't getting, paid attention to. And so I think that's a lot of what Masumi's work is about. What are the things in the field that shock you, that aren't the same old things every time, and being open to those encounters. So, and I think this last point might help as well. I think the new, instead of just replicating and describing, shows how things work. The questions of the new helps us to begin to think about the conditions that produce that sameness. So that's what the new does. It helps you to get really creative, to think about, all right, we've got this problem in education. It keeps happening over and over again. So rather than focus on the individual child that's, the recipient of these injustices, how can we focus on the structures and how those structures are working, what they're doing, what those structures allow, but also what they hide. And that's that creativity, that's that post-structural, post-human decentering of the individual and the decentering of the problem to try to understand the conditions under which those problems become repeated. So that's kind of what that creation is, yeah. Yeah.
So we're unfortunately out of
I know.
time.
I'm sorry. I talked too much.
We'll be here for a few more minutes
Yes,
if
I'll stay.
you
Yeah.
want to ask a few
Sure,
questions.
yeah.
But let's thank Dr. Jackson. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.